Kabul is known to the world as a place of checkpoints and suicide bombs. But it's a city with a hidden side. We're in West Kabul, in one of the poorest parts of the city, one of the highest rates of unemployment. I'd been told something was happening here that until recently was unknown in Kabul. Hundreds of addicts gathering to buy and take drugs. We've heard that the spot is under the bridge here. Salam. Right, this is the bridge. And there's a really, really bad stench. It's a dried riverbed here, full of rubbish. Oh, wow, look at this scene. There are a few hundred men here, crouched among the rubbish and looking at the floor. It's just full of needles, and you can see people using all around me. The men were happy to talk to me. They told me that over 600 addicts use drugs here every day, and there are over 20 spots like this throughout the city. Heroin. This gentleman here says everybody here is taking heroin. The UN estimates that 8% of the adult population has a drug problem, but the men told me of a new development. Every day, more and more young boys were turning up under the bridge, and they were all addicts. They called one boy over. Ibrahim is only 15. He'd been smoking heroin since he was 13. How many of your friends take drugs? Ibrahim says that 5 of his friends who are the same age as him, 15, are using drugs. He said he suffered from depression. Ibrahim says he started taking drugs because both his parents were killed 8 years ago in the war, in bombings. Other boys arrived to speak to me. The stories they told were of lives and families torn apart by the war. Najib is 16 and started using heroin when he was just 12 years old. Najib says that most of his friends use drugs. Yeah, they start young. They start from 11 years old. Over the last 8 years, drug cartels have started to refine their vast opium poppy harvests into heroin, a more addictive and profitable drug. Now the Afghan street price for powder, as it's known, is the cheapest in the world. Some of the men under the bridge said that boys hang out on top of the bridge here. We met another young addict, 15-year-old Ali, who'd been using heroin for the past 2 years. Ali says he's bought his drugs and now he's going to go and do them somewhere else. Ali's mother was dead and his father had fled to Iran. He took me to where he was now sleeping rough, in a little park on a traffic island. Ali preferred smoking away from the squalor under the bridge. He'd bought a wrap of heroin, about a gram, for just over £1. I wanted to know why he was so heavily addicted at such a young age. First he'd witnessed a suicide bomb in Kabul, then he went to stay with relatives in the countryside. He says while he was there, the Americans bombed his village, and dozens of people died. He saw bodies scattered everywhere. And he and other villagers had to pick up the bits of body and put them in plastic bags. Ali said the war in Afghanistan breaks his heart. He says, I'd rather not live than live through this war. Sometimes I just want to kill myself. The psychological damage of the war and the flood of cheap heroin have contributed to addiction rates doubling in the last 5 years. We were told that the problem was so severe among the child population that some were taking desperate measures to fund their habits. One child agreed to meet us at a safe house and asked for his identity not to be revealed. Mukhtar is 13 years old and started taking heroin after his parents were killed by shelling in the city. He explained how he came into contact with the drug. From the age of 8 years old, he used to be paid money by drug addicts to guard them when they were doing their drugs. He started to smoke when he was 9, and soon he was struggling to feed his habit. Mukhtar, how do you earn the money for drugs? He pays for heroin by working as a child prostitute. Mukhtar says there's a man who looks after me. I stay with him at night, and that's how I get money for drugs. At 9 years old, did you know what was happening to you? Did you know what sex was? Mukhtar said he'd learnt about prostitution from other users. He says that children are selling their bodies here because there are no jobs, there's no work, many of them addicted. What would happen to you if people knew? He told me that homosexual relationships and prostitution are taboo in Afghanistan. They're looked upon very badly, and if you're caught, you could be shot dead. While I had met child addicts from broken families on the street, I was told there was also an increasing hidden epidemic affecting parents and children in their homes. So we're going to meet a group of doctors and social workers who make home visits in the old city in the centre of Kabul. In this deeply conservative society, drug addiction is seen as a dishonor. So the Najat medical team have to visit families who are too ashamed to seek help. I asked Dr. Shinkai Minawal how bad the drug situation was among families here. In this area, there are about 130,000 families, and she says that 60% of them are addicted to drugs here. Dr. Shinkai said many men had picked up their addictions working in neighbouring Iran and Pakistan. The men use drugs as a stimulant to help them work longer hours. We've just arrived to the first family we're visiting. In the last few years, workers have started to return home, bringing their habits with them. Karim's husband was one of them. He'd now passed on his addiction to his entire family. Farima says she's got 6 children, and she pointed to this little girl here and says that her 14-year-old girl smokes opium, and she just showed me her little stash of opium. Farima says she smokes opium every day, 3 times a day. According to the UN, half of all drug users in Afghanistan give opium to their children. Everybody stopped talking now because somebody's at the door outside, and they've become very nervous. There's a lot of stigma involved in drug addiction. We've been told we have to stop filming, we have to leave. We've got to put the camera down now. That just goes to show what a sensitive subject drug addiction can be in this country. An angry group of locals had gathered in front of the house, and they were demanding to know what the doctors and social workers were doing, so we had to sneak out the back of the house. But the doctor told us to get out the area as soon as possible, because situations like that can easily escalate. We just spoke to the doctors, and they told us that they've made it back here to the centre. Dr. Shinkai said that drugs are haram, or forbidden, in Islam. The doctor says that this is very dangerous work they're doing, that their team is frequently attacked. They've had stones thrown at them, and they've even been beaten up. She said more and more children becoming addicted because the country is awash with heroin and opium. The doctor says if the government doesn't do anything about this situation, Afghanistan is going to face another disaster. I was about to discover another reason why drug addiction is destroying Afghanistan's children. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans have had to flee their homes because of fighting in the south of the country. Many have come here to Kabul and are living in makeshift shanty towns scattered across the city. The Charhaya Gambar camp is home to over 5,000 people who have fled fighting in Helmand province. Most have no access to hospitals or schools. I'm going to meet a man from a charity called Ashiana that provides basic services for the refugee camp. And he's going to take me in and introduce me to some families. Salam alaikum. Salam alaikum. Name man Rami ta hast?
Asad
Najibullah said there were many child addicts here, and not just for psychological reasons. Once again, the war was to blame. He says many of the children here have lost limbs because of the war. They've been severely affected by what's happened to them, and they're very poor, and they've got no money for medicine. He introduced me to Zarima, who was hooked on opium. This little girl is 3 years old, and you can see that she's lost her arm. Her brother told me that their village had been attacked. There was fighting between the insurgents and the government, and then all of a sudden everything in sight was bombed. They didn't care whether they were enemy or not. They bombed all the civilians, and that's when his little sister lost her arm. Her father, Mirajan, said he had no option but to give his little girl opium. He says, I couldn't get to a doctor, there was no medicine, what could I do? Since then, Mirajan had tried to stop giving her opium, but she'd suffered severe withdrawal symptoms. I asked
Documentary TV.
Mirajan when he thinks Zarima will stop taking opium, and he just said simply, well, I'll have to give her opium because she's an addict. Najibullah took us to meet another family. Salam alaikum. Gul Jumeir is also addicted to opium. Her father told me what happened. Said Ghulam has just showed us his 10-year-old daughter here. A bomb hit their house during fighting. He lost 4 of his children. 2 of his children were badly injured, including Gul Jumeir. Sangin. There had been no doctors in the village to help. This little girl's arm wasn't completely amputated, and there was a local man in the village that knew something of medicine, who had to amputate her arm, and you can imagine the pain she must have been in. That had happened 2 years ago, and she was still in pain. Now opium was part of her daily life. He says that he doesn't have much money, but he still has to give his daughter opium, and he says that opium is much cheaper than a painkiller that you get in a chemist. And he says you just need a tiny little bit of opium to ease the pain. It's very strong. The families I met were left to